Hey, welcome to Report Cards. My name is Gabe, and today we're going to be looking at the first 11 mythics from Murders at Karlov Manor. What we're looking to do in this series is review every mythic from the set and go over the pros and cons, the things I like about the designs, the things that I don't, and give it a grade. A, B, C, D, or maybe even an F. Any card that winds up getting a C or lower, I'm going to actually go ahead and redesign the card into a way that I think might be more interesting or more balanced, or just more mythic feeling overall. Now, full disclosure, I'm not a designer, I don't claim to be. I don't think I could do anyone at Wizards' job better than they could. When I'm talking about the cards, I'm not taking into consideration balance or limited set environment or anything like that. I'm just purely thinking about these things from a casual commander point of view. Everything I'm saying is just my opinion and just kind of what I think would be fun and interesting to make these cards feel a little bit more mythic. So without further ado, let's take a look at the cards from Murders at Karlov Manor. First up is Agrus, Spirit of Justice. For 2 generic, a red and a white, you get a 2/4 legendary Spirit Detective with double strike and vigilance. When Agrus, Spirit of Justice enters the battlefield or attacks, choose up to 1 target creature. If it's suspected, exile it. Otherwise, suspect it. Now, suspecting a creature means it has menace and can't block anymore. Agrus has a good stat line for the mana value that you're paying here, and those keywords really do a good job of playing both offense and defense. Now, obviously, there's some applications to this card where you suspect your opponent's creature, and in the long term, you're looking to exile it, and that, on its face, I think is pretty great. What I think is interesting about this ability, though, is suspecting a creature isn't pure upside or pure downside. It's kind of a double-edged sword. You can put it on your opponent's creatures and make it so you can get through and race them for damage, but then you're kind of making it more difficult for you to block and helping them attack you back. Similarly, you can suspect your own creatures and make them much harder to block. And when you have a double striker like Agrus on the field, making your opponent need 2 blockers is much more of a challenge. This mythic presents a lot of possibilities with how you want to use his triggered ability. Do you want to put it on your opponent's creatures and race? Do you want to put it on your creatures and race? What I like too is that there's a lot of flexibility in how you might want to get more activations out of Agrus, either by flickering him in and out of the battlefield. Maybe if you can give him haste so that when he enters the battlefield you suspect an opponent's creature, get to attack right away and get it off the board entirely. So there's a ton of interesting versatility and decision making in this card, and with any other suspect synergies you might put in your deck, I can really see him making it miserable for your opponents, attacking, blocking, or just keeping their creatures on the board, honestly. With all that in mind, I'm giving Agrus an A. And next up we have Alquist Proft, Master Sleuth. For 1 generic, a white and a blue, you get a 3/3 vigilant legendary creature human detective. When Alquist Proft, Master Sleuth enters the battlefield, investigate. And for X, colorless, a white and 2 blue, tap it, sacrifice a clue, you can draw X cards and gain X life. Alright, who doesn't like casting Sphinx's Revelation? This design doesn't really blow me away. I think, you get a good rate, a good body, getting a clue, so even if Alquist dies right away, you're left with something. Like I said, it doesn't blow me away, but it looks clearly like fun. What I'm more interested in is what they didn't do with this design. It's not just an enters the battlefield, Sphinx's Revelation. And what I mean by that is it's not just the enter the battlefield, draw 3 cards, gain 3 life, like the next iteration of so many blue-white creatures that do the same thing. So it's not going to be abused with blinking as easily as some other effects might be. I like this because it's less abusable, and it does allow some interplay from your opponents to disrupt it because of the summoning sickness. It plays into decks that are already using clues or investigate mechanics, as well as blinking, so there's some versatility there. And I also like that it doesn't just feed into itself just by generating clues over and over so that you can continuously keep casting Sphinx's Revelation over and over again. So overall, this is a pretty well-balanced card, but it has a lot of explosive potential, and like I said, everyone likes drawing a bunch of cards and gaining a bunch of life, and what's not to love? Next up is Anzrag, the Quake-Mole. For 2 generic, a red and a green, you get an 8/4 legendary Mole God. Whenever Anzrag the Quake-Mole becomes blocked, untap each creature you control. After this combat phase, there's an additional combat phase. For 3 generic, 2 red, and 2 green, Anzrag must be blocked each combat this turn if able. Holy moly. I love to see extra combat steps. There's really been an influx of cards that step into this kind of design space lately. By himself, Anzrag can be multiple combat steps, and that is pretty deadly, especially if there are multiple opponents. Your enemies are going to have to be really mindful of how they're blocking, and not just mindlessly chumping Anzrag and giving an extra combat step away. Interestingly, Anzrag can kind of act as removal if your opponent only has like one creature to block with, or even if they have multiples, and Anzrag can kind of get in there a couple times and take them both out. As far as the design goes, I think the 4 toughness is perfect. It's just enough to, dodge lightning bolts and not get chumped too easily. But then again, as long as you have a couple 2/2s, you can at least trade for Anzrag. It makes him fairly reliably killable in combat, assuming there aren't any tricks up your sleeve. The 8 power, however, seems a bit excessive. For 4 mana, I think this could have easily been shaved down to 6 power, or probably less. Especially considering that in a dedicated deck with Anzrag as your commander, you're very likely going to see him on the table turn 3 reliably. I could see that getting pretty frustrating. All in all, this is a very exciting design with a lot of raw power. I like that it's just a good, beefy Gruul creature. It can also kind of play into a forced blocks strategy. Overall, if I was going to tweak it, which I would like to a little bit, I would definitely tone down the 8 power, or maybe just raise the mana value a little bit. But I have to grade this card a solid A. Alright, now we come to Aurelia's Vindicator. Get ready, there's a lot of words on this one. So for 2 generic, 2 white, you get a 4/2 flying lifelink angel with ward 2. It also has disguise, which means that you can cast this card face down for 3 generic mana. And then you can pay the disguise cost at any time, instant speed, can't be responded to, and that costs us 3 generic, a white, and then X generic mana. And when you pay that cost, you get to turn Aurelia's Vindicator face up to exile X other creature cards from the battlefield or from graveyards. Then when Aurelia's Vindicator leaves play, those cards are returned to their owner's hands. Is it just me, or does it seem like white is always getting the mythic that showcases a set mechanic in a way that uses as many words as possible? There are 4 keywords on this card, it only has 2 toughness, so it's not really good at winning combat. Even if you disguise it and try and surprise your opponents, unless they're blocking with a 1 power creature, your Vindicator is not surviving this combat. If you squint just a little, you quickly realize this is more or less a mashup of Exalted Angel and Angel of Serenity. Vindicator can be disguised on turn 3, then flipped and attacking on turn 4 just like Exalted Angel, and it can be undisguised for 7 mana and exile 3 creature cards just like Angel of Serenity. There's definitely a lot of power when you have this much versatility, since you can play Vindicator as just a big flying lifelinker, or you can dial in just the right amount of removal for that X cost to undisguise it and either take out your opponent's creatures, or you can just kind of hide a bunch of creatures from your graveyard under the Vindicator so that if your opponent gets in and attacks you, you can chump block and trade your Vindicator for all the creatures that were in your graveyard. So it's nice how Vindicator fits, really in any part of your curve. But all that said, I just don't like the vibe of this card. It's being pulled in a couple different directions here. An aggressive, vulnerable attacker, and a versatile, vulnerable removal spell. I don't like either half of the card. I don't think it feels mythic, since it's just a mashup of cards we've already seen before, and frankly, I don't think anyone's excited by. I'm open to the idea that this card plays a lot better than it looks to me, but the design just reads so clunky, I just have to grade this one a D. And now we come to our mono blue mythic of the set, Conspiracy Unraveler. For 5 generic and 2 blue, you get a 6/6 Sphinx Detective, that's a bit of a tongue twister, with flying. Conspiracy Unraveler also says you may collect evidence 10 rather than pay the mana cost for spells you cast. And what that means is you can exile from your graveyard any number of cards with total mana value 10 or greater. So I haven't really been impressed with most of the collect evidence cards from the set, but this one definitely piques my interest. Being able to cast spells without paying any mana is incredibly powerful, even if you have to jump through some hoops to do that. Conspiracy Unraveler is trying to turn collect evidence into an impression of the delve mechanic a little bit here. I think that makes for exciting gameplay, but probably adds a lot of difficulty in balancing. Part of me would have loved to see this card read collect evidence X, where X is the cost of the spell, but I can imagine that just leads to comboing off a whole chain of spells and things get kind of out of hand. As is, I think this card offers enough intrigue to be worth exploring and trying out, but I'm pretty torn on the grade for this one. I want to give it a B since it plays in some really powerful design space, and it uses a new mechanic. But I'm going to give this one a C because I kind of selfishly want to make a few tweaks. Again, I don't really have any major knocks against this card. I think it's trying something new with a new mechanic, and it's definitely splashy. But I feel like for the cost you're paying and the setup you have to do, this should read a little bit differently, so I'd like to take a crack at it myself. We've got another mono-white mythic now, and fortunately this one is a lot more interesting, I think, than Aurelia's Vindicator. So here's Delney, Streetwise Lookout. For For 2 generic and a white, you get a 2/2 legendary human scout. Delney says, creatures you control with power 2 or less can't be blocked by creatures with power 3 or greater. And if an ability of a creature you control with power 2 or less triggers, that ability triggers an additional time. This card really gives your deck building some really interesting areas to focus on. The first ability kind of encourages go-wide strategies, saboteur creatures, maybe even defenders. And the second ability just has tons of potential. I like that this is nearly identical iteration of Yarok's ability, but this limitation allows it to be just mono-colored, cheaper mana value to cast. And while it encourages some similar deck building ideas, it really can give you a completely different focus. Of course, at the same time, I would love to combine it with other double triggers effects and creatures. That is definitely an appealing part of this card. While both abilities are pretty disparate, each one offers a fun and I think unique avenue to explore. There are simply loads of possibilities with this card, and I think the limitations encourage a lot more creativity and maybe using some cards that wouldn't normally make the cut. Finally, I think finding a way to marry the two strategies would be a really interesting puzzle to solve, and I'm curious to see what kind of solutions players will come up with. I feel like every time you see a Delney deck, it could be dramatically different than the last time you saw one. And anytime you've got a creature that can encourage that much variety, I think you definitely have a solid A on your hands. Alright, now we have Etrata, Deadly Fugitive. For 1 generic, a blue, and a black, you get a 1/4 legendary vampire assassin with Death Touch. Face down creatures you control have, for 2 generic, a blue, and a black, turn this creature face up. If you can't, exile it, then you may cast the exile card without paying its mana cost. Etrata also reads, whenever an assassin you control deals combat damage to an opponent, cloak the top card of that player's library. The possibilities on this card are exciting. When I first read it, it made me want to search for every card that involves putting things face down. I really like how it encourages you to look at cards with that text in a completely different way. In my experience, Manifest was a mechanic that was just okay. When you'd manifest lands, it was kind of like getting a free creature. Manifesting creatures was more or less ideally what you wanted to do because then you could turn them up at some point. And then if you manifested any other card type, it was basically less than ideal because you could never cast it. You were just getting a generic 2/2, and that's not something that excites me. But Etrata changes all of that because now you can put anything face down under your control and you'll still be able to cast it. In fact, you might be getting a huge discount on the spell. And unless I'm wrong here, it seems like the timing restrictions don't apply either, and if that's true, those would be 2 huge benefits. I really like this as a form of card advantage because you'll be able to cast your own spells and follow your own plan like you would normally, and then you get to steal things from your opponent. A lot of players love casting their opponent's spells. Etrata will let you do that on her own, and if you're really looking to take advantage of that ability, you can jam your deck full of assassins. Personally, I think Thieving Amalgam, Primordial Mist, and Scroll of Fate are looking way more attractive than they ever have before, and so I'm excited to see how those cards interact with Etrata. So Etrata brings a whole new twist to an old mechanic that I personally found to have a lot of feel-bad limitations to it, and any card that makes you want to revisit an old mechanic like that and see it in a completely new light, that's a solid A. Our first mono-red mythic is Expedited Inheritance. For 2 red, you get an enchantment that says, whenever a creature is dealt damage, its controller may exile that many cards from the top of their library. They may play those cards until the end of their next turn. This is a card that just makes you say, wow. Firstly, the volume of cards that this is going to let you see is staggering. Next, just costing 2 mana is very unexpected. And to top it off, your opponents have access to this ability as well. Now, certainly you don't want your opponents benefiting off of cards that you're playing. So by spending mana on this card, you don't really want them to be able to get too much of an advantage out of it. And that's definitely a potential drawback, especially since it's a May ability, so you can't force your opponents to exile their entire library just by dealing infinite damage to their creatures. So if that drawback bothers you, like it does kind of bother me, there are definitely ways to mitigate it, though as far as I can tell, you really have to look outside of red for the most effective answers to that. This absolutely looks like the kind of card that if you build your deck around it, it will do some insane things. And if you do unleash it onto the board, you really don't know what might happen. So to me, the unbridled, wild dreams type potential that this card has makes it an all-star design. Absolutely an A. From 1 red mythic to another, we have Incinerator of the Guilty. For 4 generic and 2 red, you get a 6/6 dragon with flying and trample. Whenever Incinerator of the Guilty deals combat damage to a player, you may collect evidence X. When you do, Incinerator of the Guilty deals X damage to each creature and each planeswalker that player controls. So we finally arrived to our customary red mythic dragon of the set, and I'm happy to say this one does not disappoint. It harkens back to Balefire Dragon, so it's not a completely original design, but there are a few noticeable changes. You still get a 6/6 flyer, but you're paying 1 mana less, and that can be a really big difference. But the most important change in my mind is having Trample. Whereas Balefire could be chump blocked and never really get a chance to shine, having Trample on Incinerator the Guilty all but guarantees that you're going to burninate your opponent's creatures and planeswalkers. I love this application of Collect Evidence. I feel like it works thematically, like, look at all this evidence I found proving your guilt. Now burn! I also like that the cost is open-ended, so you can get as precise as you need for whatever the board state might look like. And as a side note, it also does give you a repeatable way to exile your entire graveyard, if that's of benefit somehow. I'm not really sure, but it's just something to note. I'm not a huge fan of just rehashing an old design in a new coat of paint, but honestly I think this card strikes a great balance between power and showcasing what a new set mechanic can do. So I'm gonna have to give this one an A. Our next card is Intrude on the Mind. For 3 generic and 2 blue, you get an instant that says, reveal the top 5 cards of your library and separate them into 2 piles. An opponent chooses one of those piles. Put that pile into your hand and the other into your graveyard. Create a 0/0 colorless Thopter artifact creature token with flying. Then put a +1/+1 counter on it for each card put into your graveyard this way. This is a bit of a head scratcher. Obviously the Fact or Fiction vibes are very real. However, there are several what I would consider to be major drawbacks. First, obviously, it costs an extra blue mana. Secondly, you don't see any more cards than you would if you cast Fact or Fiction. And third, and most important in my opinion, you separate the piles and your opponent chooses. That may not seem like a tangible drawback, but anyone who's cast a lot of Fact or Fictions will recognize that as a downgrade. With Fact or Fiction, your opponent had to do all of the guesswork, trying to decide which cards are valuable to you and which cards aren't, and then carefully balancing the 2 piles, weighing the pros and cons of every single card. It was kind of fun just watching them struggle. And in the end, you were assured to get whatever card you wanted most. And a lot of times your opponents would choose poorly and just build an awesome pile that gave you everything you wanted and more. Jeez, I need to cast more Fact or Fictions. Just talking about it, I'm really enjoying the thought of my opponents agonizing over that. But with Intrude on the Mind, you're generating the piles, which means you're trying to trick your opponents into misvaluing the cards. And you don't get to guarantee what you're going to get. The offshoot of that is getting a Thopter token, which is nice. It's not nothing, but it doesn't feel very mythic, does it? Just looking at the scenarios of the possible outcomes here, you get 0 cards and a 5/5, you get 5 cards and a 0/0, you get 4 cards and a 1/1, 1 card and a 4/4, 3 cards and a 2/2, or 2 cards and a 3/3. Out of all those possibilities, drawing 4 or 5 cards at instant speed for 5 mana both seem pretty good, but the rest of the outcomes are just, a flash flying creature, or essentially just getting a Mole Drifter. And believe me, I love a good Mole Drifter as much as the next guy, but at Mythic Rarity, I don't think so. I don't really see this card being any better than a D. And the last Mythic we're reviewing in today's video is Kaya, Spirit's Justice. For 2 generic, a white and a black, you get a Kaya Planeswalker with 3 starting loyalty. Kaya's passive ability says, whenever 1 or more creatures you control and or creature cards in your graveyard are put into exile, you may choose a creature card from among them. Until end of turn, target token you control becomes a copy of it, except it has flying. For +2 loyalty, surveil 2, then exile a card from a graveyard. For +1 loyalty, create a 1/1 white and black spirit creature token with flying. And for -2 loyalty, exile target creature you control. For each other player, exile up to 1 target creature that player controls. There's a lot of text to make sense of on this card. When I read that passive and saw that getting my creatures exiled or creatures from my graveyard exiled was the condition for it to work, I was trying to decide, is that even good? But we'll come back to that passive ability. Let's look at the loyalty abilities first. When it comes to Planeswalkers, I love +2 loyalty abilities. It does a lot to buffer your Planeswalker's survivability, and it usually means you can activate the minus abilities way more frequently. For Kaya's +2, I think Surveilling 2 is very reasonable, and I really enjoy Incidental Graveyard Hate. Having a second ability that adds loyalty is terrific, and I think anytime you're creating tokens by adding loyalty, you have a really strong Planeswalker on your hands. I find Kaya's -2 to be very reminiscent of Eaten Alive and Rite of Oblivion. Having to exile your own creature as a cost instead of just sacrificing it is definitely worse, but you do get to exile a creature for each opponent you have, and that is exponentially better. And since Kaya can make spirits on her own, you can just use those as fodder for her ability. On the whole, I would say all of her abilities are very passable. On those merits alone, I would definitely give Kaya an A. But I think there's even more going on here than meets the eye. Looking back at her passive ability, she wants you to exile your own creatures. So not to go too deep into the rabbit hole here, but I think the sequencing is going to look something like +1 to make a spirit token, +2 to surveil 2 and dump an expensive, powerful creature into your graveyard, and Off of that same loyalty activation, exile that powerful creature from your own yard. This will turn the spirit token you created last turn into a copy of that creature. Now, I don't know exactly what kind of creature you want to be using for this situation. I think you can use your own imagination there, but I think there's just loads of possibilities in this Planeswalker design. When you look at her that way, I would honestly say Kaya is more or less an Orzhov version of Sneak Attack, as long as you have a token in play. Oh, and by the way, it doesn't even have to be a creature token. Any token will do. That's right, your treasure or clue tokens can turn into giant flyers. So all of that has me really excited about the card. I'm really interested to see what interactions I can find with Kaya and what interactions other people will find, and honestly just to see how she plays out in a game and see what other unexpected directions this card might take us. So Kaya, Spirit's Justice, absolutely nay. So there we have it, the first 11 mythics from Murders at Karlov Manor. Thanks for watching. I hope you found some of my insights interesting, and maybe you see some of the cards a little differently than you did before. If not, thanks for watching anyways, and I'll try and do better next time. Let me know what you think of my grades, and be sure to look out for part 2. That's all for this episode of Report Cards. I'm Gabe from Unsolicited Designs, and who asked me anyways?